Sarah Mitchell had always thought the old farmhouse looked peaceful from the highway. The white paint peeled like ancient skin, and the wraparound porch sagged under years of neglect, but something about it called to her. When the real estate agent mentioned the price was almost too good to be true, Sarah should have asked more questions. Instead, she signed the papers within a week. The house sat on 40 acres of rolling Tennessee hills, surrounded by dense woods that stretched for miles. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down a winding dirt road. Sarah loved the isolation. After her messy divorce and the stress of city life, she craved silence and space to heal. Moving day arrived with dark clouds gathering overhead. The weather forecast predicted severe thunderstorms, but Sarah pressed on with her plans. She had taken time off work and hired movers who charged extra for the remote location. Everything had to happen today. By afternoon, the movers had finished unloading her belongings. Sarah stood in her new living room, surrounded by boxes and cupboard furniture. The old hardwood floors creaked under her feet, and every window rattled when the wind picked up. She made mental notes about repairs needed, but overall felt satisfied with her decision. As evening approached, the storm intensified. Rain drummed against the windows like impatient fingers. Sarah had managed to unpack her bedroom and kitchen essentials. She made herself a simple dinner and tried to ignore the thunder that seemed to shake the entire house. Around 10 o'clock, the power went out. Sarah fumbled for the flashlight she had wisely kept within reach. The beam cut through the darkness, casting strange shadows on unfamiliar walls. She decided to go to bed early and deal with unpacking tomorrow when the storm passed. But sleep would not come easily. The house seemed to amplify every sound. Branches scraped against the roof like fingernails on wood. The wind howled through gaps around the windows. Sarah pulled her blankets tighter and tried to convince herself these were normal sounds for an old house in a storm. Then she heard something different. Footsteps on the front porch. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart racing. She strained to listen over the storm. There it was again. Deliberate footsteps moving across the wooden boards. Someone was walking back and forth on her porch. She grabbed her flashlight and crept to the bedroom window. The glass was fogged with condensation and streaked with rain. Sarah wiped a small section clear and peered out, but the darkness was complete. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard for a split second. She saw nothing unusual. The footsteps continued for several minutes, then stopped. Sarah waited, barely breathing. Maybe it had been a tree branch or debris blown by the wind. Old houses made strange noises during storms. She was letting her imagination run wild. Just as she started to relax, she heard a new sound. Someone was trying the front door handle. The metal rattled and clicked as unseen hands tested the lock. Sarah's mouth went dry. She had definitely locked the door before bed, but suddenly could not remember if she had checked all the windows. The house had so many entry points, and she was still learning its layout. Sarah reached for her cell phone, then remembered the poor reception in this area. During the day, she could sometimes get 1 bar if she stood by the kitchen window. In this storm, with the power out, she doubted any signal would get through. The door handle stopped rattling. Sarah counted to 60, then crept out of her bedroom. She tiptoed down the hallway, flashlight beam dancing ahead of her. The front door came into view. It appeared secure, but Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Water was seeping under the door. Not just rain blown by wind, there were actual puddles forming on the floor inside. Someone with soaking wet clothes had been standing right outside her door. Sarah backed away from the entrance, her mind racing. Should she call out and demand to know who was there? Should she try to make it to her car? The garage was detached, requiring a dash across the open yard in the storm. Before she could decide, she heard a sound that made her freeze completely. Someone was walking around the house, testing windows. She could track their progress by the gentle rattling of each window frame as they checked for unlocked latches. The intruder moved methodically from window to window. Sarah realized they were circling the entire house, looking for a way inside. She thought about the kitchen window she had opened earlier to air out paint fumes. Had she remembered to close and lock it? The footsteps paused at the back of the house. Sarah heard a faint scraping sound, then silence. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure it could be heard over the storm. Minutes ticked by with no further sounds. Then the kitchen door handle began to turn. Sarah ran back to her bedroom and quietly closed the door. She pushed her dresser in front of it, then grabbed the baseball bat she had unpacked earlier. The wooden floor felt cold against her bare feet as she positioned herself behind the bed, bat raised and ready. Downstairs, she heard her kitchen door creak open. Slow, careful footsteps entered her house. The intruder was inside now, moving through rooms they had never seen before, learning the layout just as Sarah had been doing all day. The footsteps paused frequently, as if the person was examining her belongings. Sarah heard boxes being moved, drawers being opened. They were searching for something specific, taking their time despite the risk of discovery. Sarah gripped the bat tighter and tried to control her breathing. She needed to think clearly. The bedroom window opened onto the porch roof. If she could get outside quietly, she might be able to reach her car. But the storm would make climbing treacherous, and her pursuer might hear her movements. The footsteps began climbing the stairs. Each step seemed to last forever. The old house groaned under the weight, and Sarah counted 15 steps total. The intruder reached the top floor and paused again. Sarah's bedroom was the first door at the top of the stairs. She heard them try the handle. When it would not turn, they pressed against the door. The dresser held firm, but Sarah knew it would not stop a determined person for long. Then, unexpectedly, the footsteps moved away. They continued down the hallway, checking other rooms. Sarah realized her barricade had worked. The intruder assumed the door was simply locked and moved on to find easier access. But they would be back. And Sarah was trapped on the second floor of an unfamiliar house with a stranger roaming the halls below. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she guided her horse Thunder along the dusty mountain trail. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain of the Colorado wilderness. She had been riding for 3 hours, checking the fence lines on her family's ranch that stretched across thousands of acres. This was her weekly routine, something she had done every Tuesday for the past 5 years since taking over ranch operations from her aging father. The 28-year-old woman loved these solitary rides through the backcountry. They gave her time to think and escape from the endless paperwork and responsibilities that came with running one of the largest cattle operations in the region. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her weathered cowboy hat provided much-needed shade from the relentless Colorado sun. As Thunder navigated around a bend in the trail, Sarah noticed something unusual ahead. At first, she thought it might be a fallen log or a large rock, but as she drew closer, her heart began to race. It was a person lying motionless on the ground next to what appeared to be a motorcycle that had crashed into a cluster of pine trees. Sarah immediately urged Thunder into a faster pace, her rancher instincts kicking in. Living this far from town meant that help could be hours away, and she had seen enough accidents over the years to know that time was often the difference between life and death. The motorcycle was a sleek black machine, expensive-looking and clearly built for speed rather than rough terrain. She dismounted quickly, her boots hitting the rocky ground with a soft thud. The rider was a man, probably in his 30s, wearing a leather jacket and jeans. His helmet had come off in the crash and lay several feet away. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she checked for signs of life. His breathing was shallow and labored, and there was blood seeping from a wound on his head. "Hey, can you hear me?" Sarah called out, gently shaking his shoulder. The man's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing striking blue eyes that seemed to look right through her. He tried to speak, but only a weak whisper escaped his lips. Sarah pulled out her cell phone, hoping against hope that she might have signal this far into the mountains. The screen showed no bars, just as she expected. The nearest hospital was 40 miles away in the town of Cedar Ridge, and the closest neighbor was at least 15 miles down the mountain. She was completely on her own. The injured man was trying to say something, his lips moving with great effort. Sarah leaned closer, straining to hear his words over the wind rustling through the pine trees. My name is," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Alexander. Blackwood." Sarah nodded, trying to keep him conscious and talking. "Okay, Alexander. I'm Sarah. You've been in an accident, but I'm going to help you. Can you tell me where it hurts?" Alexander's hand moved weakly toward his chest, and Sarah noticed for the first time that his breathing was becoming more irregular. There was something about his pale complexion and the way his strength seemed to be fading that told her this was more serious than just a motorcycle accident. She had seen enough injured animals and people on the ranch to recognize when someone was fighting for their life. "Stay with me, Alexander," she urged, taking off her jacket to use as a pillow under his head. "Help is coming." It was a lie, but she hoped it would give him something to hold on to. As she worked to make him more comfortable, Sarah noticed something odd about Alexander's appearance. Despite the obvious trauma from the crash, there was something almost regal about his features. His hands, though dirty from the accident, were soft and well manicured, not the hands of someone who worked with them for a living. His clothing, while now torn and bloodied, was clearly expensive. Even his motorcycle, she realized, was a custom-built machine worth more than most people made in a year. "Who are you?" she wondered aloud. But Alexander's eyes had closed again, and his breathing was becoming even more labored. Sarah knew she had to make a decision. She could try to ride back to the ranch and call for help, but that would take at least 2 hours round trip, and she wasn't sure Alexander had that long. Or she could try to load him onto Thunder and attempt to get him to medical help herself, though the rough terrain made that extremely dangerous for an injured person. As she debated her options, Alexander's eyes opened once more. This time there was an urgency in his gaze that made Sarah lean in closer. "Listen to me," he whispered with what seemed like his last reserves of strength. "There are things, important things, you need to know. Save your strength," Sarah replied, but Alexander shook his head weakly. "No time," he breathed. "My family. We're not ordinary people." His words were coming in short gasps now. "There's a reason. I was riding through here, looking for someone." Sarah frowned, not understanding what he meant, but she could see that talking was taking everything he had left. "Don't worry about that now. Just focus on breathing." But Alexander continued, his voice growing fainter with each word. "You have to understand, my bloodline, it's ancient. Goes back centuries. We've been guardians of something important." The wind picked up, causing the pine needles overhead to whisper and dance. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. There was something in Alexander's tone, something in the way his blue eyes seemed to burn with intensity, even as his life ebbed away, that made her believe he was telling the truth about something extraordinary. What kind of guardians? She found herself asking, though part of her mind told her she should be focusing on getting him medical attention instead of listening to what might be the delirious ramblings of a dying man. Alexander's hand moved slightly, reaching into his jacket pocket with tremendous effort. Sarah helped him, and her fingers closed around a small object that felt cold and metallic. "Take this," he whispered. "Keep it safe. When I'm gone, you'll be the only one who knows." Sarah looked down at the object in her palm. It was an ornate silver locket intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The metal seemed to pulse with a strange warmth, despite feeling cold to the touch. As she examined it more closely, she noticed that the symbols appeared to shift and change in the afternoon light, as if they were alive. Alexander's breathing became more shallow as Sarah held the mysterious locket in her trembling hands. The afternoon shadows were growing longer, and she knew the time was running out. The injured man's skin had taken on an ashen pallor, and despite her efforts to keep him comfortable, she could see that he was slipping away. "Alexander, what does this mean?" Sarah asked, holding up the locket so he could see it. "What am I supposed to do with this?" His eyes focused on the silver pendant with what seemed like his last bit of consciousness. A faint smile crossed his lips, and for a moment he looked peaceful despite his dire condition. "You'll know," he whispered. "When the time comes, you'll understand everything." Sarah felt a wave of frustration mixed with fear. Nothing about the situation made sense. She was a simple ranch owner who spent her days dealing with cattle, horses, and the practical challenges of rural life. Ancient bloodlines and mysterious guardians belonged in fantasy novels, not in her real world of veterinary bills and property taxes. "I don't understand any of this," she said, more to herself than to Alexander. "I'm just a rancher. I fix fences and raise cattle. I don't know anything about whatever you're talking about." But when she looked down at Alexander again, his eyes had closed for the final time. His chest rose and fell once more, then went still. Sarah sat back on her heels, staring at the lifeless form of the stranger who had just turned her ordinary Tuesday afternoon into something completely surreal. The silence of the mountains pressed in around her. Only the sound of wind through the pine trees and Thunder's occasional snort broke the quiet. Sarah had seen death before on the ranch, but this felt different. There was something profound about watching a complete stranger die in such an isolated place, especially after his cryptic final words. She looked down at the locket again, turning it over in her hands. The craftsmanship was unlike anything she had ever seen. The silver seemed to shimmer with an inner light, and the strange symbols carved into its surface appeared to tell some kind of story, though she couldn't begin to decipher what it might mean. Practical concerns began to override her confusion. She needed to report the accident and Alexander's death to the authorities. His body couldn't be left here for wild animals, and someone would be looking for him eventually. The expensive motorcycle suggested he wasn't just some random drifter. He was someone with money and probably family who would want answers. Sarah carefully placed the locket in her shirt pocket, feeling its strange warmth against her chest. She would figure out what to do with it later, after she dealt with the immediate crisis. Using her phone to take photos of the accident scene for the police, she documented everything she could think of, though the lack of cell service meant she would have to wait until she reached the ranch to make any calls. Loading Alexander's body onto Thunder was impossible by herself, so Sarah made the difficult decision to cover him with her spare blanket and mark the location carefully so she could guide the authorities back to the crash site. She used rocks to create a cairn and tied one of her bright red bandanas to a nearby tree branch. The ride back to the ranch felt like the longest journey of her life. Every mile seemed to stretch endlessly as Sarah's mind raced with questions. Who was Alexander Blackwood? What kind of family business involved ancient bloodlines and mysterious guardians? And why had he given the locket to her, a complete stranger? As the familiar buildings of the Martinez Ranch came into view, Sarah felt a mix of relief and dread. The comforting sight of the barn, the farmhouse where she had grown up, and the pastures full of grazing cattle represented everything normal and predictable about her life. But the weight of the locket in her pocket reminded her that nothing might ever be quite the same again. She unsaddled Thunder quickly and hurried into the house to call the sheriff's department. The conversation with Deputy Collins was straightforward enough. She reported finding a motorcycle accident victim and provided the GPS coordinates she had marked on her phone. Collins said he would organize a recovery team and asked Sarah to come into town the next morning to give a formal statement. After hanging up the phone, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and pulled out the locket again. In the warm light of her home, it looked even more extraordinary. The symbols seemed to dance and shift as she watched, creating patterns that almost looked like they were trying to communicate something. On impulse, she tried to open the locket, expecting to find a photo or some other personal memento inside, but the silver pendant seemed to be sealed shut with no visible hinge or opening mechanism. The frustration of not being able to unlock its secrets made her want to throw the thing across the room. Instead, she decided to do some research. Sarah fired up her old laptop and searched for Alexander Blackwood online. To her surprise, several results came up immediately. Alexander Blackwood was apparently the heir to a massive industrial fortune, son of Victoria Blackwood, who owned Blackwood Enterprises, a company involved in everything from mining operations to historical preservation. According to the articles Sarah found, Alexander had been something of a mystery man. Unlike other wealthy heirs who filled gossip columns with their party exploits, Alexander seemed to avoid publicity. There were only a few photos of him online, mostly from charity events or business meetings. In every picture, he looked serious and intense, with those same striking blue eyes that had gazed at Sarah as he lay dying on the mountain. One article mentioned that Alexander was known for his interest in genealogy and historical research. He had apparently spent years tracing his family's lineage and had funded several archaeological expeditions around the world. The Blackwood family tree, according to the article, could be traced back over 800 years to medieval England. Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling overwhelmed by the implications. This wasn't just some random stranger who had crashed his motorcycle on her property. Alexander Blackwood was wealthy, connected, and apparently obsessed with his family's ancient history. His death would make news, and that meant Sarah would inevitably be drawn into whatever story the media decided to tell about his final days. More disturbing was the realization that Alexander's claims about his bloodline and being a guardian of something important might not have been the delusional ramblings of a dying man. If he really had spent years researching his family's history and had the resources to pursue answers anywhere in the world, then maybe there was truth to his mysterious final words. The locket seemed to grow heavier in her hands as Sarah considered the possibilities. Whatever Alexander had been protecting, whatever secret his family had guarded for centuries, it was now her responsibility. a responsibility she never asked for and didn't understand, given to her by a stranger in his final moments of life. The next morning arrived with an unexpected complication. Sarah had barely finished her coffee when she heard the sound of helicopters overhead. Looking out her kitchen window, she saw 2 black aircraft circling her property before landing in the pasture near her barn. These weren't the sheriff's department helicopters she had been expecting. Men in dark suits emerged from the helicopters, moving with military precision across her ranch yard. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she watched them approach her house. These people clearly weren't local law enforcement, and their arrival so soon after Alexander's death couldn't be a coincidence. A sharp knock at her front door made Sarah jump. She instinctively reached for the locket, which she had kept in her pocket since the previous afternoon, and made sure it was hidden beneath her shirt. Something told her these visitors wouldn't be friendly if they knew about Alexander's final gift. Opening the door, Sarah found herself facing a tall woman with silver hair and the coldest green eyes she had ever seen. The woman wore an expensive, black suit and carried herself with the kind of authority that came from being used to getting exactly what she wanted. "Miss Martinez, I am Victoria Blackwood," the woman announced without preamble. "I believe you were the person who found my son yesterday." Sarah's mind raced. This was Alexander's mother, the powerful businesswoman she had read about online. But Victoria Blackwood's presence here, so quickly after the accident, raised immediate questions about how she had learned of her son's death, and why she had come personally, instead of sending representatives. "Yes, I found the accident site," Sarah replied carefully. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Alexander seemed like a good man in the brief time I spoke with him." Victoria's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes seemed to pierce right through Sarah. "I'm sure this has been traumatic for you. May I come in? There are some questions I need to ask about my son's final hours." Sarah hesitated but stepped aside to let Victoria enter. 2 of the men in suits followed her inside, positioning themselves near the door in a way that made Sarah feel trapped in her own home. These weren't grief-stricken family members coming to collect their loved one's belongings. This felt more like an interrogation. "Please sit down," Victoria said as if she owned the place. "Tell me exactly what happened when you found Alexander." Sarah recounted the basic facts of finding the motorcycle crash, trying to help Alexander, and his eventual death. She kept her description simple and factual, making no mention of their conversation about bloodlines or guardians, and certainly nothing about the locket that seemed to be burning a hole in her pocket. Victoria listened without interruption, her green eyes never leaving Sarah's face. When Sarah finished her account, there was a long moment of silence that felt increasingly uncomfortable. "Did my son say anything to you before he died?" Victoria asked finally. "He told me his name," Sarah replied, which was technically true. "He was very weak. Most of the time he was unconscious." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. Alexander was a young man with many interests and hobbies. He sometimes carried valuable items with him during his travels. Did you happen to notice anything unusual among his belongings? The question sent alarm bells ringing in Sarah's mind. Victoria wasn't here to grieve for her son or to thank Sarah for trying to help him. She was here looking for something specific, and Sarah had a growing suspicion that the locket was exactly what Victoria Blackwood wanted to find. "I didn't go through his things," Sarah said. "That seemed inappropriate. I was focused on trying to help him and then on getting back here to call for help." One of the suited men stepped forward and whispered something in Victoria's ear. The older woman's expression grew even colder, if that was possible. "Miss Martinez, I hope you understand that my family has been through a terrible tragedy. We simply want to recover all of Alexander's personal effects so we can lay him to rest properly." "Of course," Sarah replied. "The sheriff's department is handling the recovery of his body and belongings. I'm sure they'll make sure everything is returned to your family." Victoria stood up abruptly, her movement sharp and predatory. "I think there may be some confusion here. My son was carrying something that belongs to my family, something that has been passed down through generations. It's not the kind of item that should go through normal police procedures." The threat in Victoria's voice was barely concealed now. Sarah realized she was dealing with someone who was used to getting her way through intimidation and who viewed normal legal processes as obstacles to be bypassed rather than rules to be followed. "I don't know what you're referring to," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Like I said, I didn't take anything from the accident scene." Victoria studied Sarah's face for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if she was lying. "Miss Martinez, my family has considerable resources. We can be very generous to people who help us, but we can also be quite persistent when people choose not to cooperate." The message was clear. Sarah could either give Victoria what she wanted, willingly, or face the consequences of refusing to help one of the most powerful families in the region. But something about Victoria's cold demeanor and the military-style precision of her arrival made Sarah deeply uncomfortable about handing over the locket. "I wish I could help you," Sarah said, "but I honestly don't have whatever it is you're looking for." Victoria's smile was thin and completely without warmth. "I hope for your sake that's true. My son's death has been very difficult for our family, and we're determined to recover everything that belonged to him." After Victoria and her entourage left, Sarah felt shaken and confused. The woman who had just walked out of her house bore no resemblance to a grieving mother. Victoria Blackwood had shown no emotion about her son's death, no curiosity about his final moments, and no gratitude toward the person who had tried to help him. Her only concern had been recovering some mysterious family heirloom. Sarah pulled the locket from her pocket and examined it again in the afternoon light. Whatever this thing was, it was important enough for Victoria Blackwood to personally fly to a remote ranch within hours of learning about her son's death. It was valuable enough to bring armed men and implied threats. More importantly, Alexander had chosen to give it to Sarah instead of keeping it with him for his family to recover. He had specifically told her to keep it safe and that she would understand its importance when the time came. That suggested he hadn't trusted his own family with whatever secret the locket contained. As evening approached, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. Instead of turning the locket over to Victoria Blackwood or to the local authorities, she would keep it safe just as Alexander had asked. She would try to understand what he had died protecting, even if it meant making enemies of one of the most powerful families in the state. That night, Sarah hid the locket in the old safe her grandfather had installed in the basement of the ranch house. But as she locked it away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just committed herself to a path that would lead her far from the simple life she had always known. 3 days after hiding the locket, Sarah's quiet ranch life began to unravel in ways she never could have imagined. It started with small things that might have seemed like coincidences to someone less observant. Her internet service became unreliable, cutting out at strange times. Her landline developed a persistent clicking sound that hadn't been there before. Vehicles she didn't recognize began driving slowly past her property at odd hours. Sarah had grown up on the ranch and knew every regular delivery truck, every neighbor's vehicle, and every pattern of traffic on the rural road that passed her land. The black SUVs that appeared 3 or 4 times a day were definitely not normal. They never stopped, just cruised past slowly enough for the occupants to study her property. On Thursday morning, Sarah discovered that someone had been on her land during the night. Bootprints in the soft earth near her barn showed that at least 2 people had walked around her buildings, checking doors and windows. Nothing was missing or damaged, but the message was clear. Victoria Blackwood's people were watching her, and they weren't being subtle about it. The pressure was clearly intended to make Sarah nervous enough to contact Victoria and offer to return whatever the family thought she had taken. But the intimidation tactics had the opposite effect. They convinced Sarah that the locket was even more important than she had realized, and that Alexander had been right not to trust his own family with it. Sarah decided she needed help, but the problem was figuring out who she could trust. The local sheriff's department was competent enough for handling routine problems, but they would be completely out of their depth dealing with the kind of resources Victoria Blackwood could bring to bear. Going to the media seemed risky, both because Sarah didn't know enough about the situation to explain it properly, and because powerful people like Victoria usually had ways of controlling what got reported. Instead, Sarah decided to follow the one lead she had. During her online research about Alexander, she had found mentions of Dr. Elena Vasquez, a professor of medieval history at the University of Colorado, who had consulted on several of Alexander's genealogical research projects. If anyone might understand what Alexander had been protecting, it would be someone who knew about his family's historical interests. Sarah called the university and managed to schedule a meeting with Dr. Vasquez for Friday afternoon. She told the professor that she had some questions about the Blackwood family history related to the recent death of Alexander Blackwood, without going into specifics about the locket or her confrontation with Victoria. The drive to Boulder gave Sarah time to think about what she would tell Dr. Vasquez. She couldn't start by claiming to have a mysterious artifact without sounding like either a treasure hunter or someone having a mental breakdown. She would need to approach the subject carefully and see what the professor might reveal about Alexander's research interests. Dr. Elena Vasquez turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of gentle manner that made students feel comfortable asking difficult questions. Her office was cramped with books, papers, and artifacts from various historical periods. Several computer monitors showed different genealogical databases and historical documents. "I was very saddened to hear about Alexander's death," Dr. Vasquez said as Sarah settled into the chair across from her desk. "He was one of the most dedicated genealogical researchers I've ever worked with. His knowledge of medieval family lineages was extraordinary for someone without formal academic training." "What kind of research was he doing exactly?" Sarah asked. Dr. Vasquez leaned back in her chair, considering her answer carefully. Alexander was particularly interested in families that claimed to be guardians of religious or historical artifacts during the medieval period. His own family, the Blackwoods, had some fascinating connections to several knightly orders and religious communities in England during the 12th and 13th centuries. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Guardians of artifacts? What kind of artifacts?" "Well, that's where things get interesting," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Many medieval families claimed to be protectors of everything from pieces of the True Cross to documents that supposedly proved various religious or political claims. Most of these stories were probably legends that grew up around families wanting to seem more important than they actually were." "But Alexander thought his family's claims were real?" Dr. Vasquez nodded slowly. "Alexander believed that his family had been entrusted with protecting something of genuine historical significance. He spent years trying to trace the artifact through historical records, but he was always very secretive about what exactly he was looking for." Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out printouts of some of the online articles she had found about Alexander. These mention archaeological expeditions that he funded. Was he looking for this family artifact? "Partly," Dr. Vasquez said, examining the articles. "But Alexander also believed that there were other families, other bloodlines that had been given similar responsibilities centuries ago. He thought that if he could find evidence of these other guardian families, it might help him understand what his own family was supposed to be protecting." "Did he find any evidence of other families?" Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. "Alexander came to see me about 6 months ago with some very interesting findings. He had traced several family lines that seemed to have similar stories about being guardians of important artifacts. But what was unusual was that many of these families seemed to have lost track of their artifacts over the centuries." "Lost track of them?" "Exactly. Alexander's theory was that some crisis in the medieval period had forced these guardian families to scatter and hide their artifacts in new locations. He believed that the knowledge of where these items were hidden had been passed down through the generations, but that many families had lost the information over time." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of crisis would have caused something like that? Dr. Vasquez pulled out a thick folder from her desk drawer. Alexander believed it was connected to the suppression of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. When King Philip V of France and Pope Clement V moved against the Templars in 1307, it created a crisis for many families and organizations that had been associated with them. The Knights Templar, a military religious order that had accumulated enormous wealth and influence during the Crusades. When they were suppressed, many people who had been connected to them found themselves in danger. Alexander thought that some of these people had been guardians of important artifacts and that they had been forced to hide their treasures and scatter to avoid persecution. Sarah's mind was racing. If Alexander was right, then the locket might be connected to events that had happened over 700 years ago. It might be part of a network of hidden artifacts that had been scattered across the world by people fleeing religious and political persecution. Dr. Vasquez, Sarah said carefully. Hypothetically speaking, if someone today came into possession of one of these artifacts, what would it mean? What would they be supposed to do with it? The professor studied Sarah's face with sudden intensity. That's a very specific question, Miss Martinez. Is there something you're not telling me about your connection to Alexander? Sarah realized she had revealed more than she intended, but something about Dr. Vasquez's manner made her feel that she could trust the academic with at least part of the truth. Alexander gave me something before he died. He said I would understand its importance when the time came, and that I needed to keep it safe. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, her eyes bright with scholarly excitement mixed with concern. Show me. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then pulled the locket from her jacket pocket. The moment Dr. Vasquez saw it, her expression changed completely. The professor's eyes widened and she reached out with trembling hands before stopping herself. My God, Dr. Vasquez whispered. I never thought I would actually see one of these. You recognize it? Dr. Vasquez stood up and closed her office door, then pulled the blinds on her windows. Sarah, what you're holding is incredibly dangerous. Not just because it's valuable, but because of what it represents and what certain people will do to get their hands on it. The professor returned to her desk and pulled out a magnifying glass, gesturing for Sarah to place the locket on the desktop. This is a Templar Guardian seal. See these symbols around the edge? They're not decorative. They're a code that identifies which specific artifact this seal was meant to protect. Sarah looked more closely at the intricate carvings she had noticed before. Under the magnifying glass, she could see that what she had taken for random decorative patterns were actually tiny, precisely carved symbols that seemed to tell a story. Alexander showed me drawings of several of these seals during our research sessions, Dr. Vasquez continued. Each one was unique, designed to identify a specific guardian family and their particular responsibility. But this is the first actual seal I've ever seen. Most of them were destroyed or lost centuries ago. What does it say? What was Alexander's family supposed to be guarding? Dr. Vasquez studied the symbols carefully, occasionally consulting reference books from her shelves. The symbols indicate that the Blackwood family was entrusted with protecting a religious manuscript of some kind. But not just any manuscript. These markings suggest it contained information that the church considered too dangerous for general knowledge. Dangerous how? During the medieval period, there were certain documents that challenged official church doctrine, or contained information that could be used to question the authority of religious or political leaders. The Templars were known to have collected many such documents during their time in the Holy Land. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the implications. So somewhere out there is a 700-year-old document that Alexander's family was supposed to be protecting? Possibly. But here's what makes this even more complicated. Dr. Vasquez pointed to a particular section of symbols on the locket. These markings indicate that this guardian seal is linked to others. The Blackwood family wasn't working alone. They were part of a network of guardian families, each protecting a piece of something larger. A piece of what? Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Alexander believed that certain powerful families and religious orders had conspired to hide evidence that would fundamentally change how people understood Christian history. Documents that proved the church had suppressed inconvenient truths about the early Christian period. Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. And you think this locket is some kind of key to finding these documents? I think this locket identifies you as the new guardian of whatever the Blackwood family was protecting. And I think that's why Victoria Blackwood is so desperate to get it back. But why would Alexander give it to me instead of keeping it in his family? Dr. Vasquez looked troubled. That's what worries me most about this situation. Guardian seals were only supposed to be transferred under very specific circumstances. Either the current guardian was dying without an heir, or they had determined that their own family could no longer be trusted with the responsibility. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Alexander didn't trust his own mother. It would seem that way. And if Alexander believed that Victoria couldn't be trusted with the guardian's responsibility, then we need to figure out why. Dr. Vasquez turned to her computer and began pulling up genealogical databases. I've been tracking several guardian family lineages for the past few years, trying to understand what happened to the network after the Templar suppression. Most of the families either died out or lost track of their responsibilities over the centuries. But not the Blackwoods. The Blackwood family maintained their wealth and influence, which helped them keep their historical records intact. But wealth and influence can also lead to corruption. Maybe Victoria sees the family's guardian role as a source of power rather than a sacred responsibility. Sarah watched as Dr. Vasquez pulled up family trees and historical documents on her computer screens. The amount of information the professor had compiled was staggering, representing years of careful research into medieval family lineages and their connections to the Knights Templar. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer," Dr. Vasquez said. "Are you prepared to take on the responsibility that Alexander passed to you? Because once you start down this path, there won't be any going back." "What exactly would I be responsible for?" "First, you would need to find and protect whatever artifact the Blackwood family was supposed to be guarding. That means figuring out where it's hidden and making sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And second," Dr. Vasquez hesitated, "you would need to decide what to do with the information once you find it. Documents that have been hidden for 700 years were hidden for good reasons. Making them public could have consequences that we can't predict." Sarah thought about her quiet life on the ranch, her simple routines of caring for cattle and maintaining property. Everything Dr. Vasquez was describing sounded like something from an adventure movie, not the reality of a practical rancher from Colorado. But she also thought about Alexander's final moments, the urgency in his voice when he told her to keep the locket safe, and the cold calculation she had seen in Victoria Blackwood's eyes. Whatever was happening here, it was real, and Alexander had trusted her with something important enough to die protecting. "How would I even begin to find this hidden artifact?" Sarah asked. Dr. Vasquez smiled for the first time since seeing the locket. "That's where this becomes really interesting. Each guardian seal contains not just the family's identification, but also clues about where their artifact is hidden. The problem is that the clues are coded in ways that require knowledge of medieval symbolism and historical context to interpret, knowledge that you have. Some of it, and what I don't know I can research. But Sarah, if we do this, we'll be working against Victoria Blackwood and whoever she's allied with. These people have resources we can't match, and they've already shown they're willing to use intimidation tactics." Sarah looked down at the locket again, its silver surface seeming to gleam with its own inner light. "Alexander chose me for a reason. Maybe I don't understand why yet, but I'm not going to let him down." Dr. Vasquez nodded slowly. "Then we'd better get started. The first thing we need to do is decode the location clues on the seal. And we need to do it quickly, before Victoria realizes that you're not going to give up the locket voluntarily." As they began the painstaking work of analyzing the symbols, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a threshold into a world far more complex and dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. But somewhere out there was a truth that had been hidden for 7 centuries, and she was now the only person standing between that truth and those who would use it for their own purposes. Working late into the night in Dr. Vasquez's office, Sarah watched as the professor methodically decoded the symbols on the locket. Each tiny marking was compared against medieval reference texts and historical documents. By midnight, a picture was beginning to emerge that was both fascinating and terrifying. "The location clues point to a place called Raven's Hollow," Dr. Vasquez announced, looking up from her computer screen with exhaustion and excitement in her eyes. "It's about 60 miles north of your ranch, in a section of the national forest that was once owned by a Blackwood ancestor named Sir Edmund Blackwood." Sarah had heard of Raven's Hollow. It was a remote area known mainly to serious hikers and hunters, accessible only by rough Forest Service roads. The terrain was challenging, with steep ravines and dense pine forests that could hide almost anything. The symbols indicate that Sir Edmund built some kind of structure there in the late 1300s, Dr. Vasquez continued. "Officially, historical records show it as a hunting lodge, but the seal suggests it was actually a repository for the artifact the family was protecting. A 700-year-old building would still be standing? Possibly. Medieval stone construction was built to last, especially if it was designed to protect something valuable. And if it's in a remote location where few people would stumble across it, it might have survived largely intact." Dr. Vasquez printed out topographical maps of the Raven's Hollow area and began marking locations based on the clues from the locket. The symbols reference a place where the raven watches over the sacred word, and stone guardians protect what must not be lost. That suggests we're looking for a building with carved decorations, probably positioned to overlook the surrounding area. Sarah studied the maps, noting how isolated the region was. If Victoria's people are watching me, they'll notice if I disappear for several days to go searching through the mountains. We'll have to be careful about that. But Sarah, there's something else you need to know. Dr. Vasquez's tone became serious. I've been tracking news reports about other guardian families, and there's been a disturbing pattern over the past few years. What kind of pattern? 3 families that I identified as possible guardians have suffered what appeared to be accidents or mysterious deaths. A house fire in Scotland that killed the last member of the MacLeod family. A car crash in Ireland that eliminated the O'Brien line. A climbing accident in Switzerland that took out the heir to the Zimmerman family. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late hour. You think someone is systematically eliminating the guardian families? I think someone is collecting the artifacts that these families were protecting. And I think Alexander's death might not have been an accident. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Vasquez was right, then Victoria Blackwood wasn't just trying to recover her family's artifact. She might be part of a conspiracy to gather all of the hidden medieval treasures that had been scattered centuries ago. But why would she kill her own son? Dr. Vasquez pulled up more files on her computer. Look at this. I've been tracking the Blackwood family finances through public records. Victoria has been investing heavily in historical research companies, archaeological expeditions, and private security firms. She's building an organization specifically designed to locate and recover historical artifacts. That doesn't necessarily mean she's behind the other deaths. No, but it suggests she has the resources and motivation to be involved. And if Alexander discovered what his mother was really doing, he might have realized that she couldn't be trusted with the guardian's responsibility. Sarah thought about Victoria's cold demeanor when she had visited the ranch, her complete lack of grief over her son's death, and her single-minded focus on recovering the locket. The woman had shown no interest in how Alexander had died or what his final moments had been like. Her only concern had been the family artifact. We need to get to Raven's Hollow before she figures out where it is, Sarah said. Dr. Vasquez nodded. But we also need to be prepared for the possibility that she already knows about the location. If the Blackwood family has been guarding this secret for centuries, Victoria might have access to information that we don't. They spent the next 2 hours planning their expedition to Raven's Hollow. Dr. Vasquez would use her academic connections to arrange for equipment and supplies under the cover of a routine archaeological survey. Sarah would need to find a way to leave her ranch without drawing attention from Victoria's surveillance team. There's one more thing, Dr. Vasquez said, as they prepared to leave her office. Once we find this artifact, we'll need to decide what to do with it. If it really contains information that powerful people have been willing to kill for, making it public could put us in serious danger. What kind of information could be that dangerous? Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Alexander believed that some of the hidden documents contained evidence that would fundamentally challenge the historical foundations of Christianity. Proof that certain key events in early Christian history didn't happen the way the Church claims they did. Like what? Documents that might prove the Gospels were altered or edited centuries after they were written. Evidence that certain religious doctrines were invented for political reasons, rather than based on historical truth. Information that could undermine the authority of religious institutions that billions of people trust. Sarah began to understand why these secrets had been hidden for so long. The kind of information that could start wars, or end them. Religion has been used to justify conflict for centuries, but it's also been a source of comfort and meaning for countless people. Destroying people's faith could cause as much harm as protecting corrupt institutions. As they left the university, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just responsible for protecting an old artifact, she was potentially responsible for deciding whether to release information that could change the course of human history. The drive back to her ranch gave Sarah time to think about what she was getting herself into. 3 days ago, her biggest concern had been a broken fence in the north pasture. Now she was planning to search for a 700-year-old repository of secrets that powerful people were willing to kill to protect. But as she thought about Alexander's final moments, his trust in giving her the locket, and the cold calculation she had seen in his mother's eyes, Sarah knew she didn't have a choice. Whatever was hidden at Raven's Hollow, it was important enough for a dying man to pass the responsibility to a complete stranger rather than trust his own family. By the time Sarah reached her ranch, she had made her decision. She would find the artifact that Alexander's family had protected for centuries, and then she would decide what the world needed to know about the secrets that had been hidden for so long. But first, she had to figure out how to get to Raven's Hollow without leading Victoria Blackwood's people directly to the prize they were all searching for. The expedition to Raven's Hollow required careful planning to avoid Victoria's surveillance. Sarah arranged for her neighbor, Tom Wilson, to watch her cattle for a few days while she supposedly visited a sick relative in Denver. Meanwhile, Dr. Vasquez organized the archaeological equipment they would need and hired 2 graduate students who specialized in medieval archaeology to assist with the search. 3 days later, Sarah met the team at a remote trailhead 40 miles from Raven's Hollow. They would hike the remaining distance to avoid the attention that vehicles might attract. The graduate students, Marcus and Jennifer, had been told they were investigating reports of medieval stone structures in the area, which was technically true. The hike through the Colorado wilderness was challenging, with steep terrain and dense forest that seemed untouched by human presence. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if the landscape itself was guiding them toward their destination. On the second day of hiking, Marcus spotted something unusual through his binoculars. "There's definitely some kind of stone structure up ahead," he called back to the group. "It looks like it's built into the cliff face about half a mile from here." As they approached the site, Sarah could see why Sir Edmund Blackwood had chosen this location for his repository. The stone structure was positioned on a narrow ledge overlooking a deep ravine, accessible only by a treacherous path that would discourage casual visitors. The building itself was smaller than Sarah had expected, maybe 20 feet square, but it was clearly built to last forever. The stonework was masterful, with precisely fitted blocks that had weathered 7 centuries with minimal damage. Carved ravens decorated the corners of the structure, their stone eyes seeming to watch over the surrounding wilderness. Above the entrance, barely visible after centuries of weathering, were symbols that matched those on the locket. "This is incredible," Jennifer whispered as they examined the building. "The craftsmanship is consistent with 14th century English church architecture, but adapted for a much smaller structure." Dr. Vasquez was studying the entrance, which was sealed by a heavy stone door with no visible locking mechanism. "The door is designed to be opened only by someone with the proper key," she announced. "And I think we know what that key is." Sarah pulled out the locket and approached the entrance. As she held the silver pendant near the door, she noticed that some of the symbols carved into the stone began to glow with a faint light. The locket itself grew warm in her hands, and she heard a soft clicking sound from within the door mechanism. Slowly, the massive stone door swung inward, revealing a chamber that had been sealed for centuries. Cool air flowed out, carrying the scent of old stone and something else. Something that reminded Sarah of old books and ancient parchment. The interior of the repository was dominated by a stone altar in the center of the room, surrounded by carved pillars that supported the roof. The walls were covered with medieval frescoes depicting knights, religious figures, and symbols that Sarah was beginning to recognize as Templar markings. But it was what rested on the altar that took Sarah's breath away. A metal chest, perhaps 2 feet long and elaborately decorated with gold and silver inlay, sat exactly where Sir Edmund Blackwood had placed it over 600 years ago. The preservation was remarkable, as if time had stopped inside the sealed chamber. Dr. Vasquez approached the chest with reverent care, examining the lock mechanism and the decorative symbols covering its surface. "This is definitely Templar work," she said quietly. "The craftsmanship and symbolic elements are consistent with other Templar artifacts from the early 14th century. Marcus and Jennifer were documenting everything with cameras and measurement tools, treating the discovery as the archaeological find of a lifetime. But Sarah was focused on the chest and the growing certainty that whatever was inside would change everything. She thought she understood. About history and faith, the chest opened easily when Dr. Vasquez applied gentle pressure to its lock, revealing contents that had been preserved in perfect condition by the dry mountain air. Inside were 3 ancient manuscripts, their parchment pages bound in leather covers that still retained their original color and flexibility. "These are written in Latin," Dr. Vasquez observed as she carefully examined the first manuscript. "But the script is older than I expected. This looks like it could be from the 2nd or 3rd century, not the medieval period." As the professor translated the opening passages, her expression grew increasingly amazed and troubled. Sarah, this appears to be a collection of early Christian documents that were never included in the official Bible. Letters between apostles, accounts of Jesus' teachings that contradict some official gospel narratives, and records of early Christian communities that practiced very different forms of worship. Different how? Dr. Vasquez continued reading, her voice growing quiet with the weight of what she was discovering. These documents suggest that early Christianity was much more diverse than the church has admitted. There were apparently groups that believed Jesus was a teacher and prophet but not divine, others that believed women could serve as religious leaders, some that thought the resurrection was metaphorical rather than literal. Sarah felt the world shifting around her as she began to understand what Alexander's family had been protecting, the kind of information that would challenge everything people believe about Christianity. More than that, Dr. Vasquez replied, opening the second manuscript. This one appears to be a record of how the official Christian doctrine was established. It describes political meetings where religious leaders decided which beliefs would be considered orthodox and which would be declared heretical. You mean the church created official doctrine for political reasons? According to this document, yes. It suggests that many core Christian beliefs were chosen not because they were more historically accurate, but because they served the political needs of religious and secular leaders who wanted to consolidate power. The third manuscript was the most shocking of all. It contained what appeared to be first-hand accounts of Jesus' life, written by people who had actually known him. And these accounts painted a picture very different from the Gospels that became part of the official Bible. This describes Jesus as a radical teacher who challenged both religious and political authority, Dr. Vasquez explained as she translated key passages. But it also suggests that many of the supernatural elements of his story were added later by followers who wanted to create a more powerful religious mythology. Sarah sat down on a stone bench that had been carved into the wall of the chamber, overwhelmed by the implications of what they had discovered. So Alexander's family has been protecting evidence that could prove the foundations of Christianity are based on political decisions rather than historical truth. It appears that way. And now I understand why Victoria Blackwood is so desperate to recover these documents. If she's working with religious or political organizations that want to keep this information secret, then she sees herself as protecting the stability of institutions that billions of people depend on. But Alexander wanted the truth to come out. Dr. Vasquez nodded. Alexander apparently believed that people deserve to know the real history of their faith, even if that knowledge is difficult to accept. As the team carefully packed the manuscripts for transport, Sarah realized that her responsibility as a guardian was just beginning. She now possessed information that could reshape human understanding of one of the world's major religions. But using that information would inevitably cause pain and disruption for countless believers. The hike back to civilization gave Sarah time to think about what she would do with the knowledge she now carried. By the time they reached the trailhead, she had made her decision. The manuscripts would be preserved and studied by legitimate scholars, but the information would be released gradually and carefully, with consideration for how it might affect people's lives and beliefs. Victoria Blackwood and her allies had been willing to kill to keep these secrets hidden, but Sarah believed that truth, no matter how difficult, was ultimately better than ignorance. Alexander had died protecting these documents, and she would honor his sacrifice by ensuring that his final act of courage had meaning. The last guardian of an ancient bloodline had passed his responsibility to a simple rancher, and Sarah was determined to prove worthy of his trust. The truth would come out, but it would be revealed in a way that honored both the courage of those who had died protecting it and the faith of those who would be challenged by its discovery.